Hello developers! Welcome to my video series on Microsoft Flight Simulator add-on workflow. Today we're going to continue with the process of making an aircraft add-on, and we'll be adding some of the interior animations and making them work in the sim. We're using the SDK documentation and specifically the how to create an aircraft section, and we'll continue with this process. We'll be adding the interior animations or cockpit animations, specifically the NLA or the nonlinear animation tracks to the blend file. After that, we have to set up the animations to work in the sim via the interior aircraft XML behaviors file. In a previous episode, we made the exterior animations, and it's a similar process, so you should be familiar with what we do. I'm going to shorten these cockpit animation tutorials. The exterior one was brutal, right? But we covered 90% of the exterior animations. And this episode will just do the panel switches like the master, lights, pitot heat, fuel pump, avionics. And in this aircraft, we have a turn coordinator switch. With the lights, we'll review the system config file, the electrical section, and the lights section. And we'll also need to set some of the MSFS materials for the emissive lights to work. We have broken down the model into the airframe or the exterior, and now we have the cockpit and panel and interior. So we have the interior collection, panel collection. We have an exterior one, but I've hidden that for now, so we're just going to work on these collections. I will now use the interior XML and utilize the Asobo interior templates. And before we really had only one main exterior XML file, and that had the templates for the exterior airframe animations. The interior is a lot more complicated, and there are a lot more buttons, switches, and levers, and of course instrument gauges that we have to worry about. And to make all this work, we'll need to add more files into the process. The flight model config, the systems config, the engines config, cockpit config, camera config will all be reviewed. The panel XML and panel config files will also be reviewed, but in later episodes. So we have the file set up as before. So in the airframe, we had a file setup. Similar, we got some layers to worry about, the naming of parts, etc. that's in the system. So the throttles, etc. So there was a naming convention that we're not really going to use with the X0. We have collections that we can utilize for that process. And in Blender, we'll just set up those collections as we have. We just name the nodes and animations as you see fit. Usually the Asobo default naming in their templates, and you saw this in the exterior animations episode. Our aircraft is simple, so there's not a real requirement for instancing, so we don't need to go into all of the work that needs to be done for large aircraft. We don't need to instance. We'll have some knobs and switches that we have to worry about, and that should be good enough. Just make sure that when you do add anything to your model, you're matching the exterior airframe to the interior one. You don't have any overlapping parts that burst out of the cockpit or into the fuselage, etc. So we've split these things into two, and we've done that. And what we'll be doing is we'll add pilot nodes to the aircraft, and I've started that process already here. I've added an empty into the pilot seat here, and given that the name of pilot 0. And we'll just move that into the interior. So I've We can make a duplicate of that. And we'll just move that over here. And we could call that Copilot. So we've got two nodes for the pilot and Copilot to utilize so that you can get those characters in your aircraft. We'll have to review the station eye points, so this is where the camera config will come in. So you have to make sure that everything was working with the cameras and all the views, etc. I think what we had before is we were looking over the top of the aircraft, so we'll adjust that also. So we'll start animating the aircraft, and we'll have to add some switches and levers where we don't have them. Just watch your topology on the inside. We're going to have knobs and levers and seats, etc. They talk about gaps and spaces. You're going to add lights to your aircraft, so you don't want the aircraft lights to bleed into the cockpit, so to speak, from an unfamiliar spot. So no gaps and seams in the aircraft. There's some cabin details. If we had a large aircraft, maybe we want to do the area where people are sitting, like in a large airliner. We'll utilize normal maps for to show information here, the actual coil of any pieces that aren't animated. Here's what the object looks like, and we'll just use a normal map to pretend that it's a coiled wire, etc. We're going to utilize some of these collision meshes. So we're going to have a panel collision mesh. It's basically a plane that you're going to put into the aircraft. It's good for what they describe here to allow the VR to work properly and to also to block some of the light. So we're going to have that. Windshield collision. If you want the smart windshield, you'll make a windshield collision. It's basically just a box around the windshield. And then we'll have environmental occluders. We need the environmental occluder because we don't want grass growing into our fuselage from the bottom, and we don't want it to rain and snow inside our fuselage, so we'll have to add that to our model, and here's why you require that. So if you're sitting in the trees, you're not going to have the trees inside the model. The VR helpers, some additional information you'll add to your model so that you can make your model work with VR. So there's some helpers that need to be added. Basically, they're just empties in certain positions so that you can add hand positions, etc., for your model so that it can be used in VR. So handling yoke, hand, and axes and hands, wheel center, the left hand, right hand, and axis, etc. So all of that information we can add. I'm not going to do that in these episodes. This is for much later. And finally, the gauges. We'll do a lot of work in that respect. The gauges in here, we're going to talk about steam gauges. The glass cockpit is more JavaScript, HTML type stuff. So we need for our gauges with needles and so forth, we're going to have to animate those in 3D. If you are from the FSX world, most of the animations in the FSX world are 2D animations. So you just painted the needles onto a graphic. Here, we're going to actually have 3D, three-dimensional needles that will be rotated and need to work with the system. So all of these objects will need to be modeled and animated. And they talk about using a specific way to do your animations for gauges. We don't really have to follow this. This is more of a 3ds Max type thing. You can put glass over top of your instruments, and then we talk about the lights. So we'll have some empties here. They got blocks as empties. We'll have some empties to utilize for the lights. So speaking of lights, we'll have to look at the system's config that we have, and it's already got some lights that were set up from the DA62 that we had. So there's a lights section and an electrical section. These are the two things that we're going to have to modify to get the lights to work and also the electrical to work in the sim. So let's start with some simple switches and buttons. And what we'll do is we'll do this panel down here, and we'll animate these switches that are in the system. So these 8 switches, we'll animate them, and they're basically just 2 position switches. So with keyframe 0 is down and 1 is up. But let's separate all those parts. So we have some switches, and you can see these are all separated. So if they're not separated in your aircraft, that's what you'll need to do. And we should do some cleanup also and make this interior look like an interior. And we'll separate all the parts that need to be separated out. We have some throttle, etc. And we'll need to make those separate items. So let's start making our aircraft interior look a little better. What I'd like to do is change some things around. We have the throttle here. We have the mixture, which is not correct, and the prop control that has to be flipped around. Have our rudder pedals. All of these objects here are all with that default color or default texture or Microsoft material. So I can make things a little bit set up so that this panel looks more like a aircraft panel, and we'll start making things. So we'll change some of these rings around. I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to add a new material. I'm just going to call that panel black and Microsoft Standard, and I'm just going to make that black. So there we are. We now have panel black. Let's see if we can change that. So get rid of that guy and add panel black. Make this one. You get the idea. Panel black. Change that. So forth. Panel black. We can add chrome and so forth to that. So I'm just going to go through and do that, and I'll change everything that we have in the sim and make this panel look a lot better. Here's my interior now with some of the stuff set up. So I've got a throttle, I've got a prop, I've got a mixture with different colors. So I've utilized different materials. I've added a whole pile of different materials for the instruments, etc. So all of these different colors and materials are set up now. added some chrome. So chrome was just basically, I didn't use any textures yet. So there are no textures. All I did was set the color, and then I also set the metallic factors and roughness factors for all of these pieces and so forth. So I did some of the needles also, gear, anything that needed to. And we're going to concentrate on the switches down here. So I made those switch white, made them all the same, etc. And then what we're going to do is we're going to animate these switches, and it's a typical Blender animation. In the beginning of the episode, I said that we would utilize keyframes 0 and 1. Well, I did some testing already, and that didn't work. We have to have a minimum of 3 keyframes. So setting up the fuel switch pump, I already did that. So I added an animation to it here. The 0 keyframe is down. Keyframe number 1 is also down. Keyframe number 2 is up. And that's all we need to do to set up our animation for that. And then we're going to export the aircraft and build it in the sim. Let's adjust some things that we've already been looking at using the aircraft editor. We'll bring in the aircraft editor and we'll get the eye point. So I've already started doing that. Let's make this smaller. The aircraft eye point, when we added our pilot nodes, so let's pretend that our pilot will be sitting at about that position, and their eye point will be somewhere there. Excuse me. And we'll set that up. We'll do a save and resync on that. Hopefully it won't take a long time, just so that when we're in the interior, we're going to have a good view when we go straight to the cockpit view. Come on, simulator, you can do it good. So we're in the cockpit, and now it's not bad. All those lovely colors that I've got for the instrument panel show up in the, what happens if I move the, nothing much. If I look outside, if I move the, oh look at that, we got the ailerons working still, that's good. And our switches are down here, so we've got a fuel pump switch working. I've got no other switches working. We click it, it's on, and it's off. So the fuel pump switch works, so that's a good thing. So all we have to do is we have to do the rest of these. We have to animate them. We then have to set all of the electrical information. We have no fuel pump. So if we look at the behaviors and the systems, and we look at some of the electrical stuff, we don't have anything here other than a flap motor for the flaps and the general panel information. So we have no indication of whether this is on or off. Will anything happen? No. Other than that. So we need to get some electrical into the system. And the way we do that is we add all of this electrical circuits into the systems config. The convention is to put the battery, alternator, buses, and then all the circuits here, etc. And then I've already done this before. I've added a few more of all of the switches that we're going to have. So we're going to have a starter, a fuel pump, pitot heat, nav lights, landing number 1 and 2, strobe, turn coordinator, and avionics. So all of the switches, we add those to the system, to our electrical system, and the battery, and so forth. And when we save that, okay, now we've done that. We've added those electrical components to the system, and we've got some lights kind of going on here. The fuel pump, let's see what we can do with that. So if I turn on the fuel pump, we actually get electrical current running through the fuel pump. So the fuel pump electrical is now working. And the way we did that is again through the XML. So we had to set up the interior XML, the electrical information, and alternator switch circuit. Fuel pump, maybe that's in fuel. Fuel pump switch. So the fuel pump switch is in the fuel pedestal aft. Remember we copied this from the DA62. The animations are from the animations folder. And where is that? Oh dear. Handling. Okay, back. Sorry about that. Okay, it's in the fuel XML, and we're looking at the Asobo fuel switch pump. Utilizes the other template here. The default value is 1. Fuel pump subtemplate. And when we open up the fuel subtemplate, have all of that. And then you'll have your nodes. And the information here, so interaction type was from the fuel. So our interaction type is switch. So that variable is placed into there and the ID is 1. So fuel, switch, pump, ID 1. And if we look in our Blender file, we have fuel, switch, pump, 1, and fuel switch pump 1 as the node. And also you'll see that the animation name is exactly the same. The part ID for highlighting, etc. So as long as you get this information correct, you should get the animation to work. And we do that when we look at that here. We have the tooltips and we have the fuel pump turning on and off, and also the electrical turning on and off. So each of these switches is just a rocker switch. So this one has an animation that is 0, 1 is again the same, and 2 is up. So we're going to basically do that for every single switch here. And I've got what they look like, or what they are. So these are pictorials. So the first one was a fuel pump, so that one's there. This is the turn coordinator one. Not going to do that one right now. That's a little bit more complicated with the XML because it's not a standard Asobo template, so we have to make our own. Here's the pitot heat. Here's the beacon, landing light number 1 and number 2, and then the nav lights and the radio or avionics switch is there. So that's what we're going to build. And we're basically just going to animate things here. So animation, I'll just insert a keyframe for the rotation, and then I'll move over one keyframe and insert the same one again. Move over one keyframe. This time I'm going to rotate it in the x-axis. So R, X, 30. Well, that's a little bit too much. Let's see what I get here. R, X. So was that? Yeah, it was close to 30. And then enter, and I'll just insert that keyframe for the rotation. So I'll push this down into the NLA stack, and that will be the turn and bank indicator. I'm just going to do that. So we can do the same thing with all these. 0 is that position. Insert a rotation keyframe. Insert another rotation keyframe. RX 30. Insert another rotation keyframe. Push that down. This one is going to be our pitot heat. So from there, pitot heat. So what we've got is our pitot template. So it's in the de-ice area. So we need to find our de-ice. There it is, the pitot heat. It's an interaction type of switch. And again, the Asobo pitot template. Pitot template. There we are. And so we have number of, well, we don't have anything. We only have one interaction type. Is push. No, it's not a push. It's a switch. The animation name is de-ice, and the part ID and the node ID. So copy de-ice switch pitot heat, and this also de-ice switch pitot heat. And we'll save that. Give it a new name here. And then we'll export that and have a look in the sim. So let's see what happens. We built our project again. Down here, got the fuel pump, got nothing. We skipped that one. We now have the pitot heat on, off. Let's see what happens with our electrical here. Turn that on, and we have the pitot heat turning on and off. So we've set everything up for the sim. So what you need to do is you need to do all of the other switches on your own. Basically, I showed you one. You just copy that and give them the proper names. How did I find those names? Well, you have to look through each and every one of the templates, or do a search in the SDK if you can. Or what I like to use is I use one of my programs to search all that I need to search. So I use grepwin and I'm going to look at all sorts of things. Okay, I've got the model behaviors. So if we wanted to look for fuel pump, I'd look for fuel pump. It's in safety, but that's safety indicator, so that doesn't look right. How about fuel underscore pump? There we are. That's how we got the. How about pitot heat? So look for pitot heat, and we found it in the de-icing. So how about landing lights? Maybe landing. No, everywhere. So lighting is most likely where you're going to find it. So open up all of those things and then do the hunt for the node name, node ID, and animation name. And then you can set that all up. So we've got all the animations on all of the objects done, pitot heat, strobe, lights, landing light number 1, landing light number 2, nav lights number 1, and avionics master. And then in the XML for the interior, we have all the de-ice stuff, safety. So I've got alternator switches, avionics switch there. So electrical switch, avionics master, and electrical switch, avionics master, and so forth. The one thing that is special is the turn coordinator. And we'll have to get that by making our own template. And to do that, we're going to need to learn some programming skills, XML programming skills, and how these things work. So what I have is a Asobo electrical switch circuit template because it's basically a circuit that is on a switch. So our turn coordinator is going to be on the particular switch. And what we have to look at is we have to look at where we put it in the system's config. And I put this circuit turn coordinator on circuit 11. There is no Asobo template for turning on the turn coordinator like there is for the fuel pump and pitot heat, etc. So we can't do anything similar to what we did with those. So what we have to do is we have to look at the Asobo electrical. The ID in this particular case is 11. The circuit ID is going to be 11. And then you add the tooltip, title, tooltip description, so that when we look at this electrical stuff, it will populate all this information properly. And there is RPN here used for the circuit. So circuit is on-off condition based on these values, their dynamic values, etc. So this is how we're going to set up the switch for the turn coordinator. And then once we do that, we'll export and we'll see if all of your switches work. So let's have a look at all your animations now that are in the sim. So we have a fuel pump, we have a turn coordinator, We have a pitot heat, we have a strobe light, landing light, nav lights, avionics master. So we have all of these switches now working, and if we added all of those circuits to the electrical part, we should have all of these working in the debug also. So when we turn things off, we should see the actual circuit turn off also, and that turn coordinator. So all of our switches are working with the electrical circuits themselves, and the individual animations are working. When we turn on the switch, you can see the rocker switch move. So everything is working as expected. So the landing lights, let's have a look. Landing lights in this aircraft are in the front. Oh, well, we got no landing lights. Or maybe that's because it's daytime. We can't see them. Let's change it to nighttime. Oh, nothing. So our landing lights are on. Landing lights are on. What's not working here? Well, there's another thing that you need to look at. User lights. Our user lights information is full of red. So we don't have anything going on here properly with the lights. So light definition 0, light definition 1, so that's a nav red, nav green, nav white, strobe landing. We got an effect file, we got a node. I have to decipher all of this stuff now. We've got positions for everything. Let's see, node not found for this. So taxi, node not found for landing light, node not found. So we have to now review what's in the systems config for the landing lights. So the landing lights here, the type is a 3, so that's a navigation light, that's a navigation light, that's a navigation light. Number 2 is a strobe light, that's another strobe light. That is a number 1, which is a beacon light. That's a number 5. There's a landing light, and we only have 1. So we need to make 2 of them. So we have to change all of this information so that it agrees. Now the effect file for each of those things, red, that should be correct. What we don't have is a place where these things are. And usually what you have is the emissive mesh or a node. So we have a Lumi landing light. Well, in our Blender file, I don't have a Lumi there. What we got there? I have a loose landing. I have another landing light left and a landing light right. So I have different nodes. And in order to fix that, we're going to have to change all of these things. So the first few I had to change. So I've changed all of these things to a blank node for the navigation one. And I'm just going to use the position. Excuse me. So no emissive mesh and no node, just make those blank. I'm going to have something on the rudder, a strobe. Does it have a node? But I'm going to make it a strobe left and a strobe right. So on the aircraft, we're going to have a strobe left and a strobe right, node ID, so the different sizes or different areas. We can have our nav right and left for the green, but I'll show you something with the positioning, etc. So we're going to rebuild this aircraft now and see what happens when we have all of our lights. The landing light and landing light left and landing light right. So we've got all of our systems config set up. We save that and rebuild the project. So do we have any lights? Let's see. Switches on. So the landing lights, we turn them on. Oh, we get some effect information. And there they are. So we've got our lights working. Our user lights information says there's no mesh, but that seems to be working. Now the user light thing is sometimes a little flaky. You have to click on a few of the checkboxes a few times to get things working. So do we have navigation lights? I don't see any navigation lights. That's not working. Why not? Well, it still says something. So we have no node. I have a 0 here. That's the white one. Yeah. Why not? So lots of debugging to do. If I override everything, I can turn these on. Do they turn on? No. No navigation lights. Strobe lights. So left and right strobe lights, do I have those? Oh, yes I do. So I have a flashing strobe light on one side, and I have one on the other side too. So the strobe lights work, and you can see that they required a mesh name for the strobe lights. The landing lights I have as a node name. So a mesh name, so I gave that mesh, and I gave this one a node. I think this is a position, while a mesh is the actual mesh itself will glow. But I don't get the navigation lights, anything else yet. So more debugging is required, but you can do that on your own. So let's get rid of that. We have the cockpit. I only have a flashlight right now because of the fact that I don't have any interior lights yet. But the fuel pump works, turn coordinator, the pitot heat, strobe light, I can turn on and off. Okay, let's see. Strobe light is on. Strobe light is off. And externally, oh, it's still flashing. So something's wrong there too. The landing lights, and you saw those at the front. Landing lights are off. One landing light. Nope. Oh, because I'm overriding. I forgot to turn this override off. So that's probably why things are not. So I have that one. I have the other landing light. I have a strobe light on. So the strobe light is flashing. Strobe light is flashing. Can I turn it off? Turn off the strobe lights. Yes, strobe lights are off. So they are working properly. It's only the navigation lights. They don't seem to be working. If I turn on my behaviors and the electrical debug, okay, strobe lights are off, nav lights are on. So the circuit is working. All of that. Oh dear. Oh well, okay, so some debugging to do. Let's do two more switches. The main switches, so they're not rocker ones, they're toggle switches. So we're going to do the alternator, or in this case, the generator. Same thing, almost. So we have the alternator switch and we have a generator switch, and we'll have to animate those guys. So same thing, we'll just animate them and get them to toggle up and down. So we'll do the alternator. Where is its? Oh, its point is way up there, so we have to set the origin to geometry. It's not quite where we want it, so tab into edit mode and let's isolate that, and I'm going to make it in here. So let's see if I can, and then cursor to selected, and I'll put the origin at that point. So back to object mode, object set origin to 3D cursor, and I'll bring that back. Now we can do the same thing to that one. Tab, edit mode, I'll isolate it. Get the center, oops. Cursor to selected, get out, object origin to 3D cursor, and that. So this will be good here, so I'm going to go I, rotation, I, rotation, RX 30, I, rotation, and drop that one down. Do the same one for this one. Whoops, wrong, X, edit, and I'm going to remove all the animation data. I'm going to purge it because then I get the .001s. So I'll purge that, do it again. So I, rotation, I, rotation, I, oops, RX 30, I, rotation. And I shall push that one down also. So again, going through all of the electrical stuff, I need to find some electrical, the alternator template, alternator subtemplate, etc. Battery subtemplates. So what have I got here? Alternator, electrical switch, alternator 1. So I'm going to make that. So this one was the alternator. One, and the other one is the battery. Electrical switch, battery master. So number 1, the interaction type is switch. Copy that. Paste that in there. And we'll export and get that to work, and we'll see if we can utilize the basic part of those two templates. Before we rebuild, let's just step back here and understand what's happening with the electrical system. Because why is everything working when we don't have a master battery switch set up? Like everything here is working already. Well, that's because the general panel seems to be on. What happens if we start at the apron? So if we go back and get out and start at the apron, we need to go to the main menu. Hopefully this won't take too long. I'll probably have to edit the time out again. We'll see. So let's start at a parking position here and see what happens with the electrical system. Can you think of what's going to happen? And would you know why? Whatever you think is going to happen happens. I'll give you a hint. It's the flight files. The FLT files that are in your project determine whether things are working or not. So I have the effects going on. See that. Well, you'll notice here that, well, I have a turn coordinator. It's got it off, but something not quite working. So the fuel pump is on, off. Let me look at the behaviors package and the electrical system. Oh, look at this. So general panel here is red, meaning there's no electricity getting to it. So there's, no matter what I do with these switches, I can't turn anything on. Everything used to be green and turn on. Now it's red because the main battery system is not turned on. And that's because these switches aren't set yet. I don't have these things working yet. Well, why was everything working on the runway and not on the apron? I'm losing my track here. Okay. So let's go to our project. sim objects folder, and let's look at the apron flight file. So our apron flight file switches. Pitot heat, false. Beacon lights, false. Landing lights, logo lights, nav lights, strobe, taxi, pedestal lights. Systems, battery switch is false. If we open up the runway one, let's have a look-see. Avionics, engine, systems. Battery switch is set to true. So the reason that there was electricity before on the runway is because the flight file said, okay, put the battery switch on. And because we are in the apron, the battery switch is false, and I have no animation for the battery switch, so I can't turn it on. And that's why we get the red here. So that's the way you start debugging things. You have to understand and you have to put on your electrical engineer's hat. I hope it fits good, because that's the way you're going to have to debug some of this stuff. The flight files talk to the systems config files, talks to the animations, talks to the XML, talks to the blend file, like a GLTF exported files. There's so many things that you have to be aware of. So we are going to rebuild our project with our new animations, our animations on the alternator or generator in this case, and the battery. So I have an alternator and I have a battery. They're both off because remember the apron flight files said they were both off. And because they're both off, I have no power to anything in the system. If I turn the battery on, I get green. So the general panel, and it looks like my turn coordinator switch was on. So turn that off. Everything there turns on. So the aircraft, I don't have the keys working yet, so I can't start the aircraft from here. But I can turn on all of the other switches, the avionics, yeah, that, everything. So all my other switches work as expected, that if you turn the battery on, you get everything. And if I turn the battery off, everything goes off. So let's stop at this point. Well, there you have it. We have the first animations inside the cockpit. In our next episode, we'll look at the next part of our add-on build. We'll continue with a bit more complicated animations, the levers. So let's have a look at getting the throttle, prop, and mixture levers working, the air, perhaps the parking brake, and look at the 5-position magneto switch. So here we had the rocker switches on off. Well, our mags need an off, left, right, both, and start. And we'll look at that in the next one, perhaps the flaps too, and the gear. So lots of levers and the mag switches next. Thanks, good luck, and I'll see you next time.